Part 33. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 321. After a moment, William's expression seemed to be much normal. He just shook his head and smiled, and then a look of helplessness flashed in his eyes. I can't help it, and I don't want to do this, but try what this woman forced me to do. She forced me to do this, so I can only help her. I have no choice, do you understand? William's eyes were fixed directly on Lin Yu. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but let out a long sigh, and there was something complicated in his eyes. Color. What you said seems to be right. But it seems wrong. You can't explain it clearly. From your point of view, you are right about this matter, but haven't you ever thought about what will happen to their mother and son? After Lin Yu finished speaking, his eyes stared directly at William. At this time, William heard Lin Yu. After saying this, his eyes suddenly dimmed, and the corner of his mouth also evoked a bit of a wry smile, and then he sighed heavily. Well, what you said seems to be true, but now that the matter has come to this, what can we do? William turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu. There was a complete helplessness in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu didn't know what to say, so he just smiled and shook his head. After the two people walked for a while, they came to a wine cellar. Although it was a wine cellar, it was extremely luxuriously decorated. However, when they stepped in, a gloomy feeling quietly came over them. After Lin Yu felt this gloomy feeling at this time, some complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly. At this time, Lin Yu's brows seemed to be knitted together. At this time, he just shook his head, and then sighed leisurely. It's a little strange, a little weird. It seems like it has been eroded by a unique alien beast, so it looks like this. But what exactly is going on with this alien beast? I can't explain, I can't figure it out. At this moment, when William heard Lin Yu say this, he turned his head and stared directly at Lin Yu, with some complex colors flashing in his eyes. What do you mean? After Lin Yu heard William say this, he turned his head and glanced in his direction, with a meaningful smile on his lips. What do you think? Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as a torch. At this time, William was as confused as the 2-foot-tall monk, completely confused as to what Lin Yu meant by his words. At this time, Lin Yu was making secrets with both hands, and finally, the space-time beast suddenly appeared next to Lin Yu. At this time, the space-time beast directly froze this space. Fortunately, the area here was not too large. After the space was sealed, Lin Yu heard a cry for mercy. Finally, a woman walked in holding a child. The woman's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and the corners of her eyes and brows were filled with a complex color. At this time, Lin Yu also sighed quietly, but then his expression began to turn grim. Although I deeply sympathize with what happened to the mother and son, you should not take advantage of my sympathy. I think you should understand what I mean, so you'd better show up now, otherwise. Lin Yu paused immediately after saying this, and a gloomy look flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after Lin Yu finished speaking, the time and space moved directly towards the Yin ghost beast. He was extremely fast, and he had already rushed in front of the Yin ghost beast in just an instant. At this time, the Yinghui beast made a whining sound, as if begging for mercy. After Lin Yu saw this scene, a cold and stern look flashed in his eyes. At this time, his brows seemed to be knitted together. I had known this, but why did I do it in the first place? Now that you know how to beg for mercy, don't you think it's a little late? At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were blazing, and the killing intent in his body was quietly released here. The Yinghui beast's eyes were completely short-sighted, and there was a look of helplessness, as if those eyes were filled with fear. At this time, Yinghuiman made a whining sound from its mouth. At this time, Lin Yu just glared at him fiercely, "Stop talking nonsense and show up quickly. Otherwise, you will die today." After hearing what Lin Yu said, the ghost beast dared to continue pretending like this, so at this time, he directly showed his true form. After Lin Yu saw the prototype of this ghost beast, a special color flashed in his eyes. This ghost beast has 3 arms and 2 legs in a standing shape, but it has only 1 eye on its face. Each arm has 6 fingers, which looks a bit weird. Alien Beast, Dark Ghost Beast Advanced Level 6, Level 49. Qualification, Alien, Low Level. Life, 999999. Speed, 999999. Defense, 999,999. Attack, 999,999. Skill, Bewitching. Bewitching, when the Yin Ghost Beast activates its skill, it can evoke the most terrifying things in people's hearts, making people feel very terrified. At this time, Lin Yu took a look. This Yin Ghost Beast was just a high-level beast. He was not afraid at all. The current space-time beast might be able to completely destroy this little guy even with a roar. At this time, Lin Yu was nailed to the Yin Ghost Beast with a smile on his face. At this time, the Yin Ghost Beast suddenly had a bit of ominous premonition in his heart. He subconsciously took a few steps back and looked at Lin Yu with a vigilant face. "Excuse me, what do you want to do?" At this time, Lin Yu stared at the Yin Ghost Beast, with a bit of teasing in his eyes, and a playful smile on the corner of his mouth. "What do I want to do? What do you think?" Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as torches, and there was a hint of gloom in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. There was a special color in his eyes, which made the Yin Ghost Beast tremble. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 322. At this time, William was standing aside, with a bit of complacency flashing in his eyes. When he saw the kid in front of him, he seemed to be the culprit who had made him uneasy for so many years. At this time, I was furious at the time. At this time, William took a sudden step forward, and then he pinned the ghost beast to the body. Wasn't the little guy very arrogant when he was angry? Why can't he be arrogant now? You dared to scare me before. Today I must make you pay the price. After Lin Yu saw William like this, he turned his head and glanced in his direction. A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a flash of light flashed in his eyes. The look of mockery. "Otherwise, how about I give you this opportunity to take care of this little guy?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at William, and a hint of a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, William heard Lin Yu. After saying this, he was stunned for an instant. He waved his hand subconsciously and shook his head. "No, no, this can't be done, this can't be done." At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled. "Why can't you do it? Come and explain to me." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on William. At this time, William just smiled awkwardly, and then he understood what Lin Yu meant, and he made a gesture of invitation. "Sir, come here, I will just stand aside and won't say anything more." At this time, Lin Yu nodded with satisfaction, and then glanced in Yin Guishao's direction, with a strange color flashing in his eyes. "Tell me what's going on. If you explain clearly, you can still save your life. If you don't understand, don't blame me for being rude to you in the end." Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the Yin Ghost Beast. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, the Yin Ghost Beast also felt a bit helpless in its eyes. "Oh, actually I don't want to do this either, but the reason why I did this is because I was graduated by others." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what the Yin Ghost Beast said, he half squinted his eyes fixed on the Yin Ghost Beast, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. "What the hell is going on? Tell me clearly." At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the yin ghost beast, and the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a complex color. Ying Wiman just smiled like this, with a bit of helplessness in his eyes, and in the end he gritted his teeth like this. Well, if that's the case, let me tell you the truth. Before this, I was originally in the Hayman forest. But one day I accidentally fell into a trap of a person. After that person captured me, then he made a deal with me. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a special color. At this time, his eyes were fixed on the yin ghost beast, but he found that the yin ghost beast and himself did not seem to be lying. Do you know who the person who captured you is? After the yin ghost beast heard what Lin Yu said, a wry smile appeared at the corner of its mouth, and the corners of its eyes and brows were filled with a sense of helplessness. A big shot like you, with hands and eyes as big as the sky, what can I do? Do you deserve to know his identity? Of course I don't know his identity, so I don't dare to make random guesses. At this time, Lin Yu clearly caught the hesitation in the yin ghost beast. At this time, he pressed his momentum on the karma beast without any reservation. At this time, Lin Yu also had a slight sneer on his lips, and a hint of gloom flashed in his eyes. I advise you to think carefully before talking about this matter, lest you regret your decision later. Don't think that he can control your life and death. Just don't dare to say more. I can control it too. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on the yin ghost beast, and the killing intent suddenly became obvious. At this time, the yin ghost beast heard Lin Yu. After saying this, the corners of his eyes and brows were filled with a sense of helplessness, and the corners of his mouth even evoked a bit of a bitter smile. You are making things difficult for me. At this time, after Lin Yu heard the yin ghost beast say this, the murderous intention in his body suddenly appeared, and the murderous intent suddenly appeared. The gloomy and cold aura directly forced the yin ghost beast to take several steps back, and finally managed to stabilize his figure. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly smiled, and a bit of gloom and coldness flashed in his eyes. What? What did you mean by what you just said? Why didn't I understand something? After the yin ghost beast sensed the murderous intent on Lin Yu's body, he seemed to be stunned. At this time, he didn't say a word, and his eyes were full of fear. What is going on? I hope you can tell me clearly. If not, you should know what my methods are. Lin Yu's eyes were as bright as torches, and the yin ghost beast's eyebrows were full of helplessness. In the end, the yin ghost beast had no choice but to start talking. In fact, I don't know the true identity of the one who beat him. Anyway, every time he appeared, he was wearing a black robe and a faceless mask on his face. His voice was a little strange. He should have controlled it and changed his voice deliberately. But a few days ago at Mr. Williams' banquet, I felt the breath of the adults, and a few days ago I seemed to be. After the yin ghost beast said this, a cold light directly penetrated his eyebrows. At this time, the yin ghost beast fell straight down and died instantly. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes flashed with a few complex colors. At this time, his eyebrows seemed to be twisted together, and then he frowned. Asshole, what's going on? After Lin Yu finished speaking, he suddenly chased out directly. But when he chased out, there was nothing outside, not a single person in sight. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 323. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu couldn't help but clench his fists and grit his teeth. The murderous intent in his eyes began to become more and more obvious. Damn, he ran away so quickly. Who is this guy? He disappeared so quickly, which is really strange. When Lin Yu thought of this, he felt the ground again. At this time, Lin Yu came to William's side, turned his head and looked at William, and there seemed to be a complex light in his eyes. Did you offend someone? Or someone wants to kill you, so you do this? At this time, William's mouth corners also raised a few bitter smiles, and there was a kind of helplessness in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. His face was slightly pale. I don't know what's going on. There are too many people who want to kill me, so this. William said, and he just stopped, but at this time he had a cautious evasive look in his eyes. After seeing this scene, Lin Yu's eyes were filled with helplessness. Tell me, what's going on with you? If you still want to keep it a secret from me, then I have no objection, and I don't want to interfere with your life or death. After hearing what Lin Yu said, William's eyes flashed with a special color, and then he quickly waved his hand and shook his head. No, 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 how dare I deceive you? I absolutely dare not do this, absolutely dare not do this. At this time, Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on William, and there was a bit of gloom in his eyes. I don't care whether you dare or not, there is one thing you have to understand, I am here to help you now, not to harm you, so you'd better not play those tricks with me, do you understand? Lin Yu's eyes stared at William, and after hearing what Lin Yu said, William also gritted his teeth, and a bit of determination flashed in his eyes, as if he had made this great determination. I understand, I understand. If that's the case, then tell me what you want to hide. Lin Yu stared at William at this moment. At first, he was still hesitant for a while, but in the end, he gritted his teeth. This must be done by my brother, because the old man's health has been poor recently, and the family may have to change the heir. I am the first heir, and my brother is the second. If I die, it will obviously benefit him the most. After hearing William's speculation at this moment, Lin Yu nodded gently, and his eyes were aroused with some complex colors, and then he frowned slightly. Indeed, there are indeed some problems. Well, I can meet your brother when I have time and ask him what's going on. I haven't seen him yet and I don't really know his personality. After hearing what Lin Yu said, William nodded gently, and at this time, William seemed to remember something, and there was a flash of excitement in his eyes. I remember, I remember. After hearing what William said, Lin Yu couldn't help but frown slightly. He turned his head and stared at William. What did you remember? At this time, there was a playful smile on the corner of Lin Yu's mouth, and William couldn't help scratching his head. My brother will have a banquet in 3 days, and I can take you to his banquet at that time. William's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu, and there was a flash of special colors in his eyes. At this time, Lin Yu nodded gently after hearing what William said. What you said is indeed true. I can attend his banquet in a few days. I also want to see who this person is. At this time, William's face suddenly lit up after hearing what Lin Yu said. After the two finished talking, they returned to the castle together. The William family is a noble family of Country Y, and they have a large amount of resources in Country Y. With these resources, they can almost control the direction of the Parliament of Country Y, so it is extremely terrifying. This time, Lin Yu investigated this point clearly at the beginning, so he agreed to Zhuang Yudi's request so happily. The power of the Zhuang family in Longguo is also extraordinary, so they will get to know the eldest young master of the William family. William and Lin Yu came to the lobby, which was full of golden splendor, and the golden light was particularly dazzling. Lin Yu and William came to the lobby, and they lay down on a sofa. At this moment, Lin Yu half closed his eyes, and a complex color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and a faint smile appeared at the corners of his mouth. Interesting, it's really interesting. At this time, Zhuang Yudi saw the smile on Lin Yu's lips, and a bit of confusion flashed in her eyes. She raised her eyebrows slightly and turned to look at Lin Yu. What are you laughing at? After hearing what Zhuang Yudi said, Lin Yu turned to look at Zhuang Yudi, and a bit of complex colors flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Are you serious? Zhuang Yudi saw that Lin Yu had a bad look on his face, and he knew that Lin Yu definitely had nothing good to say. He followed Lin Yu's gaze and then screamed ah, and then covered his collar. Zhuang Yudi's eyes stared at Lin Yu, and at this moment Lin Yu could even feel the murderous intent in Zhuang Yudi. At this time, he quickly waved his hand and shook his head. I didn't see anything just now, I didn't see anything just now. At this time, the more Lin Yu explained, the more he felt that he was trying to smear the black. Zhuang Yudi's expression was extremely ugly. She stared at Lin Yu intently, then she clenched her fists and said through gritted teeth, "Is it true? Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning." Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 324. While the two sides were fighting, Bao Si walked over. At this time, Bao Si turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, with some deep meaning in his eyes. Lin Yu also understood the meaning of this compliment, so he turned his head and glanced at Zhuang Yudi, and then smiled like this. It's getting late, you go to bed early, I have something else to do, so I'll go out first. When Zhuang Yudi heard Lin Yu say this, she was slightly stunned at first, and then turned her head and glanced in Bao Si's direction, with a few meaningful words raised at the corners of her mouth. Smile, okay, then I won't disturb you too this time. Zhuang Yudi had a smile on her face, and there was quite a bit of meaning in the corners of her eyes and brows. At this time, Lin Yu heard what Zhuang Yudi said and saw Zhuang Yudi like this. 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. Things are not what you think. At this time, Zhuang Yudi stood up and walked upstairs. If you don't think that way, how can you know what I think? At this time, Zhuang Yudi didn't even look back, just spoke softly. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Zhuang Yudi said, a strange color flashed across the corners of his eyes and brows, and then he shook his head helplessly. Oh, now I'm afraid even if I jump into the Yellow River, I won't be able to wash it off. At this moment, Lin Yu followed Bao Si out. The moonlight this night was quite soft, and the moonlight reflected on Bao Si's face, making Bao Si look even more charming. Lin Yu turned around and glanced at Bao Si. Just one glance made him astonished. At this time, Lin Yu quickly turned his head away, and then whispered softly, "What's going on? Come on, tell me, it's getting late, and I need to go to bed early soon." Bao Si turned her head and stared straight at Lin Yu. Then her brows knitted together, with a rather tangled look on her face. At this time, she didn't know confused about these things. After Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Then he gently spread his hands and smiled at Bao Si, pretending to be proud. Actually, if you have anything to say, just say it directly. Why should you be so secretive? I feel their presence, Bao Si suddenly said this. At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Bao Si said, he was also in a fog for a while. At this time, he was like a monk who was 2 feet tall. He was confused and had no idea why Bao Si said this. Lin Yu spread his hands gently and smiled, "What do you mean by this? Why can't I understand you?" At this moment, Lin Yu's eyes were staring directly at Bao Si, and a special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Bao Si just smiled and shook her head, turning her head and staring straight at Lin Yu with her big, watery eyes. However, Bao Si looked a bit cold at this moment. When Lin Yu saw this scene, he couldn't help but be slightly stunned. After a while, Lin Yu seemed to have remembered something. "You mean people from that organization? But how could you feel the presence of guys from that organization?" Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at Bao Si, and some complicated colors flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, Bao Si smiled like this, "It's up to you whether you believe it or not. Anyway, I just told you the news. I don't think they will hurt me, but you may not know." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Bao Si said, 3 black lines appeared on his forehead, and he was speechless for a while. He rolled his eyes at Bao Si angrily. Then you give me a reason why they won't hurt you? Because I can be used by them. I feel that when they helped my husband resurrect me, their purpose was not that simple. Although I don't know what their purpose was, but compared to my husband's soul, the price they paid it seems to be bigger. Bao Si just spoke softly and unhurriedly. When Lin Yu heard Bao Si say this, a bit of solemnity flashed in her eyes. At this time, she nodded gently. And then he sighed leisurely. Oh, it's a good thing that I'm not your husband. Otherwise, I would be dead, and you can still be so calm. I don't know if I will get up from the coffin to find you. Bao Si turned her head, and at this moment she suddenly smiled. This Bao Si smile was astonishing. At this time, Lin Yu somewhat understood why King Zhou Yu was willing to play with the princess for Bao Si, because this little girl was so beautiful that the word beautiful was simply not enough to describe Bao Si. At this moment, Bao Si walked towards Lin Yu. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to be stuck in the same place, just standing there stupidly. Actually, I can tell you a secret. What secret? Bao Si had a charming smile on her lips. In fact, he never touched me. His love for me is very complicated, but I only respect him, not love. At this time, Bao Si and Lin Yu were touching their noses, and he could feel Bao Si's body. At this moment, even Lin Yu, who did not blush or beat his heart in front of the prehistoric beast, suddenly accelerated his heartbeat. Then Bao Si withdrew her body, staring at Lin Yu with a smile on her face, with a charming look between her eyes and eyebrows, and a meaningful smile on her lips. Hee, you are really interesting. Liking is really a very wonderful feeling, because I feel like I am about to fall in love with you now. Bao Si said softly, and her words were quite gentle. At this time, Bao Si was like a little fairy, and she just put her hands behind her back and walked out. At this moment, Lin Yu stared straight at Bao Si's back, with a complex look flashing in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and then he couldn't help but shook his head. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 325. Interesting, this woman is really interesting. I seem to be becoming more and more interested in this woman now. When Lin Yu thought of this, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth, and there was a hint of amusement in his eyes. But at this time, Lin Yu just said it casually, and then turned around and left. And this time in a luxurious villa somewhere. A man was holding a woman in his arms. The fabric on the woman's body was extremely thin, and the man seemed to be quite enjoying it. The man had blonde hair and blue eyes. He was wearing a light yellow nightgown. He had a bit of arrogance in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. In front of that man, there was also such a person kneeling. The man was trembling. It's a kind of panic. At this moment, there was a slight sneer on the corner of little William's mouth, and a trace of ridicule flashed in his eyes. I hope you can give me a reasonable explanation. Without this reasonable explanation, I believe you will regret coming to this world. At this time, little William was talking unhurriedly like this. When the man saw little William, after saying this, his eyes were full of fear. I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, but none of us expected that boy to be so terrible in terms of eyesight or other aspects. When little William heard this, after the man finished saying this, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and there was a hint of mockery in his eyes. You seem to be right. That man's strength is indeed terrifying, but what does this have to do with the failure of your mission? Little William's eyes were staring straight at the man, with a cold look in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, the man just started to kowtow towards little William crazily. I'm sorry, Mr. William, please give me another chance. This time I will do it myself. Little William slowly stood up and walked towards the man, with a few meaningful smiles on the corners of his mouth, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. It's interesting, but it's really interesting. Are you going to do it yourself? Are you sure you won't mess it up this time? There was some determination in the man's eyes. You are planning to hold a banquet in a few days. Mr. William will also come over by then. As long as he comes by then, I will have a way to make this thing a 100% success. What do you think? Little William heard it. After the man finished saying this, his eyes were fixed on that man. At this time, the man felt as if his body was being pressed down by a big mountain, which made him feel a little uncomfortable. Suffocated. At this time, after little William struggled for a moment, he nodded lightly. Okay, I admit that your sincerity really moved me. I can agree to your request, but you have to be clear, I don't like it. Those who go back on their word. When the man heard what little William said, he suddenly straightened up, and a look of determination flashed in his eyes. Don't worry, if I fail again this time, I will kill myself without you taking action. Little William stood up slowly, hugged the woman, and walked upstairs. I hope what you said is true. It's best not to lie to me. Otherwise, I have countless ways to make you experience the feeling of life being worse than death. After the man saw little William leaving, he suddenly collapsed on the ground. At this time, he suddenly realized that his back was completely wet with cold sweat. At this time, he just slumped down on the ground, a look of helplessness flashed in his eyes, and a wry smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. Fortunately he's gone. His eyes were staring straight at little William's back, and there was a sense of complete panic in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after little William walked upstairs, he seemed to remember something. He turned his head and glanced at the man, with a slight sneer at the corner of his mouth. I don't want to talk nonsense to you. You have to clarify one thing for me. You'd better not disappoint me then. You know I hate the kind of guy who plays tricks on me. At this time, little William said in a cold voice, with a gloomy meaning in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, after hearing what little William said, the man also had a bit of a wry smile on his lips, and a bit of helplessness flashed in his eyes. But at this time, after hearing what little William said, the man's face suddenly turned ugly with pain, and a bit of a wry smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. At this time, he was nodding like this crazily. At this time, after seeing the man like this, little William couldn't help but waved his hands gently and smiled, and the corners of his mouth curled up a little. A deep smile, and a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. I think you can leave now. Little William's voice was low and hoarse. After hearing what little William said, the man felt relieved, and then he rolled away and crawled away. At this time, William's eyes were fixed on the man's back, and a meaningful smile appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a hint of mockery flashed in his eyes. Interesting, it's really interesting, what a fun guy. After thinking about this, William's excitement became more and more obvious. At this time, the woman also walked to William's side. This time, the helper your brother found is not simple. You should not have forgotten the man in the live broadcast of the Otherworld adventure a few days ago. At this time, William's face suddenly became ugly after hearing what the woman said. He turned his head and looked at the woman, with a few solemnities in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Are you serious? After hearing what William said, the woman also sneered at the corner of her mouth, and a bit of playfulness flashed in her eyes. You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 326. At this time, little William just turned his head and glanced towards the woman. A gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and then he stepped forward with such a lunge, and then he grabbed the woman's neck, and now he heard her gnashing her teeth. I remember I told you many times that you'd better not talk to me like that, because I would be angry, but you just didn't listen. Why are you doing this? Little William's eyes were fixed on the woman, and a murderous intention spread from his body. At this time, the woman stared at little William with a smile on her face. You won't kill me anyway, so why do you do this? After struggling for a moment, the woman let go of little William, and then glared fiercely at him. I tell you today, put away your arrogant tone, never question me, and never ask me back, otherwise I will definitely make you regret it. At this time, the woman kicked Xiao William's body hard, and a bit of gloomy murderous intent flashed in the corner of her eyes and brows. At this time, little William just shook his head gently and smiled. Okay, it's all up to you anyway, it doesn't matter to me. There was a gloomy look in the woman's eyes. At this time, she just snorted coldly, and then turned around and left. At this time, little William's eyes were staring directly at the woman's back, and the corners of his mouth also evoked a somewhat meaningful smile, and there was a hint of playfulness in his eyes. What an interesting woman. At this time, a young girl walked out from outside, but what didn't match the girl's face was the calmness and coldness. The girl just turned her head and glanced coldly at little William, her eyes full of contemptuous mockery. You are really an extremely stupid guy. You haven't been able to deal with that woman until now. It's really an embarrassment to our William family. Susan, that's enough. I didn't call you here to hear this. I called you here this time because I want you to do me a favor. The woman just sat on the sofa in front of the man. She stared at the man with a smile on her face, and there was a hint of joking in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Interesting, then come and tell me, what do you want me to do for you? Little William heard this, and after Susan finished saying this, she turned her head and glanced coldly towards her. A special color flashed in her eyes, and then she spoke through gritted teeth. I want you to help me get someone. A man. At this time, Susan was naturally full of confidence. There was a hint of playfulness in the corners of her eyes and brows, and there was a hint of a meaningful smile at the corners of her mouth. Of course there is no problem with this, but I don't need to say more about what price you have to pay. Susan's eyes were fixed directly on little William, and she was smiling at this time. After hearing what Susan said, William threw a bank card directly towards Song Shan. He didn't even look back, he just said in a cold voice, there are 30 million in this card dollars, as long as you help me get it done, the remaining 30 million will be transferred to your account immediately. At this time, Susan took the bank card and half squinted her eyes. She turned her head and glanced at little William. A bit of confusion flashed in her eyes. At this moment, he couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly. Tell me who it is. I'm really curious, who can be worth such a high price? At this time, Susan was nailing little William's body, with a faint smile on the corner of her mouth, and a hint of ridicule flashed in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, little William couldn't help but raise his eyebrows slightly, and then he half closed his eyes. Do you still remember the guy named Lin Yu who was on the global live broadcast a few days ago? At this time, after Susan heard what little William said, her face suddenly turned ugly. At this time, she stood up and shook her head, and then she said this. The bank card was slapped on the table. You are crazy, but I am not crazy. You must know that the strange beast he revealed in the end has reached a terrifying level, and his own strength is even more unfathomable. You ask me to find him trouble, that's no different than seeking death. At this time, Susan was already a little hysterical. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, little William couldn't help but shake his head and smile. I believe you can handle it. At this moment, after Susan heard what little William said, a sneer appeared on the corner of her mouth. You believe me, but I don't believe in myself, so get out of the way. Susan's eyes were fixed directly on little William, but at this time, little William had no intention of getting out of the way. What if I don't let you? At this moment, Susan was speechless. 3 black lines appeared on her forehead, and her eyes flashed with complex colors. If you dare not give way, don't blame me for being rude. At this time, Susan's eyes were fixed on little William, and a gloomy murderous intent flashed in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. Although little William was smiling at this time, Susan knew how terrible this guy in front of her was. Don't be so angry, we can talk about anything, right? Promise me and do what I say, otherwise, I don't know if I will do anything extreme. At this time, little William's eyes were fixed on Susan, and Susan's fists were clenched and creaked. At this time, she gritted her teeth and stared at little William, with a gloomy murderous intent in her eyes. So you are threatening me, right? Susan stared at little William, and when little William heard what Susan said, a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Chong. Chapter 327. At this time, little William just spread his hands gently, turned his head, and looked at Susan with a look in his eyes, as if pretending to be guilty. I'm sorry, if you insist on thinking so, then I have no way, my dear Miss Susan. At this time, Susan also took a deep breath and calmed down her mood a little. He forced a smile from the corner of his mouth, and a few cold lights flashed in his eyes. Good, very good, very good, I admire you very much. You are really a scumbag for threatening your sister like this. At this time, little William slowly walked to Susan's side. He looked at Susan with a smile on his face, as if Susan's words were not an insult to him but the greatest compliment to him. Thank you for the compliment, thank you very much. At this time, Susan also took a deep breath and calmed down her mood a little. At this time, she sat back again, and the corner of her mouth even raised a few bitter smiles. It seems that now I have no other choice but to agree to you, right? After hearing what Susan said, little William nodded gently, and a little excitement flashed in his eyes and eyebrows. It seems to be true at the moment. At this time, Susan calmed down a little, and then looked at little William. Tell me, what do I need to do this time? Susan's eyes were fixed on little William. After thinking for a moment, little William took out a pill from his pocket and placed it in front of Susan. Take it. At this time, Susan's eyes had some special colors in them. Put this thing in his wine. At this time, little William smiled. Watch him eat it. Susan stood up directly, staring at little William, and a little gloomy color flashed in her eyes and eyebrows. I wonder if you are crazy or I am crazy. How can it be possible to watch him eat it? Do you think he is a fool? At this time, little William just spread his hands lightly, and a few meaningful smiles appeared at the corners of his mouth. I think my dear sister will definitely have a way, right? I think you will definitely have a way, so you should think about how to successfully implement this plan at tomorrow's banquet. At this time, Susan certainly knew how crazy little William was. She certainly knew what would happen if she didn't agree to little William. So at this time, Susan also smiled bitterly, and then spread her hands helplessly. Well, even I have to admit that you did win. At this moment, Susan's eyes were fixed on little William, and a few special colors flashed in the corners of her eyes and eyebrows. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, little William's eyes flashed with a few teasing colors. It would have been better if it had been like this earlier. I wish you all the best. Take this bank card. You should know that this is your reward. The dinner on the second day. Only William and Lin came to the banquet this time. After all, they came to get information this time. If this little William really had bad intentions, it might be more troublesome with the two of them. At this time, All the men and women in luxurious dresses were at the banquet. The young men and women were swaying in the dance floor. Lin Yu walked to a secluded corner alone, picked up the wine glass, and took a sip. A few complex colors flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his eyebrows slightly. Interesting, it's really interesting. Has the current society become so complicated? And at this time, a woman came over. The woman was wearing an evening dress, which outlined the perfect lines on her body vividly. At this moment, Lin Yu seemed to have noticed the woman's presence, but he only glanced at her and then retracted his gaze. This woman was indeed beautiful, but compared to the Bao-si who brought disaster to the country, she lacked a bit of charm, but she was indeed a beauty in the world. However, this woman seemed to lack that charm compared to Bao-si. The woman walked to the side of Lin Yu, and then sat down slowly. Her movements were very elegant, and it was obvious that she was not the kind of noble who pretended to be. Susan was still quite confident in her charm, but Lin Yu was unmoved at this time. At this time, Susan was a little impatient. She turned her head and looked at Lin Yu, and then walked in front of Lin Yu. "Sir, are you here alone?" Susan's big watery eyes were full of charm. But at this time, Lin Yu was indeed seduced by Bao-si, the little girl, a lot in the past few days, so he was not moved by Susan in front of him at all. Lin Yu just glanced at Susan, and then smiled, with a friend. 5 simple words, not too many words, not sloppy, and not only that, Lin Yu did not reveal any purpose towards Susan. At this moment, a sense of frustration arose spontaneously. Susan glanced at Lin Yu, and then the corners of her mouth also evoked a somewhat meaningful smile. "Don't you feel lonely at such a banquet without a female companion?" After Lin Yu heard what Susan said, he raised his head and glanced towards Sushan, with a somewhat complicated look in his eyes. "So what if I feel lonely? Anyway, the excitement is theirs and it has nothing to do with me. I'm just a spectator." At this time, Susan leaned towards Lin Yu, and a faint fragrance penetrated Lin Yu's nostrils. Even Lin Yu had to admit that this little girl was indeed a fairy, frightening and exciting. "Why do you say that, sir? Liveliness must have something to do with sir." As Susan spoke, she covered her face and let out a coquettish smile like Brother Ge, with a rather charming look in her eyes. At this time, Lin Yu suddenly laughed. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji Sheng Chong. Chapter 328. The two of them were talking and laughing, but at this time William happened to see Susan and Lin Yu chatting and laughing here. After seeing Susan, William's expression suddenly froze, and then he just talked casually. The beautiful woman in front of him left after a few perfunctory conversations. There was a hint of solemnity in William's eyes. Of course he knew exactly what his sister's purpose was in approaching Lin Yu. And William also knew very well that his sister was very close to little William, and her purpose this time was definitely not simple. So at this time, William hurriedly walked towards Lin Yu without saying a word. There was quite a bit of anxiety in his eyes, and the corners of his eyes and brows were even more aroused. Special brilliance. At this time, Susan also saw William walking towards her, the corners of her mouth raised slightly, with a hint of evil arc, and a bit of teasing flashed in her eyes. Susan turned her head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then she playfully stuck out her tongue at Lin Yu. "I have some things to talk about later." After Susan finished speaking, she turned around and left. Lin Yu stared straight at Susan's back. A special color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows, and there was also a hint of amusement in the corners of his mouth. He smiled, and then shook his head. At this moment, William walked over. After William walked over, his eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and there was a bit of solemnity in the corners of his eyes and brows. "You'd better stay away from her. That woman is very close to my brother, and her purpose in coming to you this time is definitely not pure." At this time, William's eyes were staring straight at Lin Yu. After hearing what William said, a very special light flashed in Lin Yu's eyes, and then he just raised his eyebrows slightly. How do you say this? Lin Yu's eyes were staring straight at William, and at this time, William's mouth also had a bit of a wry smile. Actually, she is my sister, but she has had an eccentric personality since she was a child, and she always thought that I was too rigid, so she didn't pay much attention to me at all. However, my sister is very close to Xiao William, and this time she probably did it on purpose. To approach you, if my guess is correct, it should be little William's instruction. At this time, William's eyes were fixed on Lin Yu's body, and there was a bit of a wry smile at the corner of his mouth, and then he spread his hands helplessly. At this time, Lin Yu nodded slightly after hearing what William said. A very special light flashed in the corners of his eyes and brows, and a smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. But contains countless things. So that's it? I also think there seems to be something wrong with this woman. But at first, I wasn't quite sure what the problem was. But now that you say it, I kind of understand it. The corner of Lin Yu's mouth curled up with a hint of evil. I'm afraid no one could figure out what he was thinking at this moment. After William saw this scene, a very special light flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his brows slightly. Just pay attention. But don't fall into their trap. Lin Yu nodded and smiled, and then drank the wine in one gulp. Then he turned his head and glanced at William, with a smile on the corner of his mouth. It means, but it contains countless things. Don't worry about that. How could I be so ignorant? Of course I understand what you said. After Lin Yu finished speaking, he stood up directly. At this time, a hint of amusement flashed in his eyes. Looks like it's time to go meet this little William for a while. When Lin Yu said this, the hint of joking in the corner of his mouth began to become more and more obvious. And at this time, Susan also walked to little William's side. On the second floor, little William's eyes were fixed directly on Susan, with a hint of joking flashing in his eyes, and a hint of smile on the corner of his mouth. This meant, but it contains countless things. What? Looking at you like this, you seem to be worried. What is going on? At this time, after Sushan heard what little William said, she couldn't help but let out a long sigh, and a wry smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. What other problems could there be? It's hard to deal with this Lin Yu. He's just too tricky. Susan's eyes were fixed directly on little William. At this time, after seeing Susan like this, little William also had a smile on the corner of his mouth. The meaning of this contained countless things. And then walked towards Susan. If you have anything to say, talk to me upstairs. This is not the place to talk. As little William spoke, he took Susan and walked upstairs. At this time, Susan heard what little William said. After saying this, a smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. The meaning of this was full of meaning. And then he nodded lightly. After waiting for a while, the two of them went upstairs together. At this time, little William's eyes were fixed on Susan, and a very special light flashed in his eyes, and then just like this he raised his eyebrows slightly. Tell me, can you deal with this guy? At this time, after Susan heard what little William said, she frowned slightly, and her expression obviously changed, a little unnatural. After a moment, Susan sighed leisurely, and then shook her head, with a look of helplessness flashing across her face. At this time, after seeing this scene, little William's eyes were full of surprise. His eyes were fixed directly on Susan, and his brows seemed to be twisted together. You can't even handle it? Is this guy really that difficult? Little William's voice trembled slightly, as if he couldn't believe that even Susan couldn't handle this guy Lin Yu. At this time, Susan also had a bitter smile on her lips. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 329. At this moment, after hearing what Susan said, little William half squinted his eyes. A very special light flashed in his eyes, and then he raised his brows slightly. It's interesting. It's really interesting. The more you say that, the more curious I become about this man. If this is the case, I really want to meet him soon. After little William said this, a meaningful smile appeared on the corner of his mouth. His eyes were fixed directly on Susan, and there was a bit of teasing in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. Meaning. At this time, after Susan saw little William like this, she suddenly felt a bit of an ominous premonition in her heart. His eyes stared directly at little William, and then he looked so wary. Look. What do you want to do? I advise you not to have any unreasonable thoughts. It is impossible for me to agree to your excessive demands. You should also know my principles. There is absolutely no way that I will betray you because of you. Myself. At this time, after little William heard what Susan said, he slowly walked towards Susan. He came to Susan's side and looked at the corners of Susan's eyes with a smile on his face. A bit of joking flashed between his eyebrows. Really? But if you don't agree to me, do you know what you are about to face? Little William just said in a cold voice unhurriedly. At this time, Susan turned her head and glanced coldly at little William. There was also a bit of sneer on the corner of her mouth, and a bit of coldness flashed in her eyes. I'm curious, what will happen if I don't agree to your promise? At this time, Susan's eyes were also staring directly at little William. The two people looked at each other, with a bit of determination flashing in their eyes. At this time, the corners of Susan's mouth were also raised. There was a bit of a sneer, and the color between the corners of his eyes and eyebrows was completely uncompromising. At this time, little William just snapped his fingers gently, and then a giant python suddenly appeared behind him. The giant python was shining with cold light, and everything happened behind the giant python. With barbs. At this time, little William was staring directly at Susan, with a hint of ridicule at the corner of his mouth, and a hint of coldness flashed in his eyes. He walked slowly. When he arrived at Susan's side, he stared at Susan with a smile on his face. This titanoboa hasn't eaten meat or drank blood for a long time. Legend has it that the bloodline of our William family has a special attraction for this titanoboa, so it will be extremely easy for us to conquer the titanoboa. It's just me. I don't know if this is true or not, but I want to give it a try. Little William just said it unhurriedly, and the smile at the corner of his mouth began to become more and more gloomy. At this moment, Susan heard what Xiao William said. A cold light flashed in her eyes, and the murderous intention in her body quietly began to surge. Okay, very good. As expected of my brother, he is still as despicable and shameless as before. At this time, when little William heard what Susan said, he couldn't help laughing. A bit of sinisterness flashed in his eyes, and his body showed a bit of coldness. The smile at the corner of his mouth. A sneer began to become more and more obvious. Yes, it's as despicable and shameless as before, but it seems different. At this time, Susan heard what little William said. A special color flashed in her eyes, and then she frowned slightly. What do you mean by this? Why can't I understand it? Little William walked slowly to Susan's side, and then gently lifted Susan's chin. A slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and a trace of gloom flashed in his eyes. Color? You really don't know? Little William's eyes were fixed directly on Susan, and a strange color flashed in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. At this time, Susan suddenly remembered that incident, and then she sighed leisurely, that matter may not have been done by my brother. I was investigating recently. Someone may be framing my brother. I also said indefinite. At this time, little William suddenly pinched Susan's chin, and his face suddenly became so ferocious. At this time, his whole body was shaking with anger, and then a bit of coldness flashed in his eyes. Color. He didn't do it? Are you kidding me? Do you really not know what happened back then? You advised me not to mind it, and advised me not to worry about it. But God came to persuade me again about the things that happened back then. Them. At this time, little William's face was livid, and his face began to look ugly. There was a kind of ferocity in the corners of his eyes and eyebrows. But at this time, when Susan saw little William like this, she just sighed quietly, and a bit of a wry smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. I admit that there may be some problems with this matter, but there's nothing wrong with it. He must die. No one can save him no matter what I say. If anyone wants to interfere with this, then they are against me. Little William's voice suddenly became cold, and Susan's face froze after hearing what little William said, and a bitter smile appeared on the corner of her mouth. Well, forget it, since you have said this, what else can I say? I will help you find a way to deal with this matter, but whether it will succeed is not certain. At this time, after hearing what Susan said, little William smiled slightly, and the meaning contained in it was 1,000, and a hint of playfulness flashed in his eyes. Okay, very good, since you decide to help me, then you are still my sister, but if you want to play those little tricks, then don't blame me for being rude to you. Little William's eyes were fixed on Susan, and his eyes and eyebrows were full of a gloomy and cold meaning. At this moment, Susan felt as if she was falling into an icy cave. At this moment, she felt that the little William in front of her was no longer the same as he was in the past. Little William was really scary, as if he was a devil from hell. Survival of the Beasts, Awakening the Beast Taming System at the Beginning. Author, Ji-Sheng Chang. Chapter 330. After waiting for this moment, little William seemed to have made up his mind. A slight sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth, and then he slowly walked out. It's really rude that you haven't entertained my guest for such a long time. Today I want to see how this guest of mine is doing. Little William walked out unhurriedly, leaving Susan alone on the sofa. At this time, Susan had a special color flashing in her eyes. After a moment, she sighed leisurely. In one breath, she took out a small bottle at this time. When little William left, he gave this small bottle to Susan. At this time, Susan certainly understood what little William meant, but she still couldn't make up her mind. After waiting for this moment, Susan gritted her teeth like this. No matter what, if I don't listen to that guy, I'm afraid I will probably die here this time. Compared to death, I would rather live. At this time, when Susan thought of this, his eyes evoked a special color, and then he raised his brows slightly. After a moment, Susan stood up and walked out. At this time, little William also walked slowly and went down to the second floor. At this moment, Lin Yu and William were chatting. At this time, Lin Yu and little William looked at each other. At this moment, little William just smiled like this. If you didn't know how despicable he was and just looked at his appearance, you would definitely think that this guy was a sunny boy. At this time, after Lin Yu saw this scene, a gloomy look flashed in his eyes, and then he frowned slightly, and the murderous intention in his body was quietly surging. At this moment, William also followed Lin Yu's gaze and found little William, who was walking towards the two of them with a glass of wine in his hand. At this time, William lowered his voice and said to Lin Yu, "He is my brother Xiao William, but this guy has a very weird temper. You'd better be careful." After Lin Yu heard what William said, there was something special in his eyes, and then he nodded gently and smiled, "Of course that's no problem, I'm also curious, what about you? Who is my brother?" Little William walked up to the two of them, and then stared at Lin Yu with a smile on his face. A special color flashed in his eyes, and then nodded gently. "Hello, sir." "Brother, seeing how extraordinary this gentleman is, aren't you going to introduce him to me?" This little William behaved kindly and had a respectful attitude. If William hadn't told Lin Yu what little William had done before, Lin Yu would have really not believed that this little William turned out to be what William said. At this time, William just glanced at little William coldly. "I still have some things to do, I have to go back first, you two can talk." After William finished speaking, he turned around and left. After hearing what William said, little William couldn't help but shake his head, and then he sighed leisurely. "Oh, my brother is good at everything, but his temper is a bit weird, which is really a headache." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what Xiao William said, he couldn't help but smile. He turned his head and glanced at Xiao William, and then raised his brows slightly. "I don't understand what little Mr. William means by saying that. I won't talk about my brother. Anyway, you two are friends. You can ask him when the time comes, but I am very interested in you." At this time, after Lin Yu heard what little William said, he just waved his hand and smiled, "But I have no interest in you." At this moment, a low sound came from a distance. Because the banquet was held halfway up the mountain, the sound should be an explosion at the foot of the mountain. It's just that although the party heard the explosion, it seemed as if they were not surprised and did not stop at all. Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on little William. Based on his intuition, he felt that little William must have done this. At this time, he couldn't help but frown slightly, with a flash in his eyes. It was a bit gloomy. "Did you do this?" Lin Yu's eyes were fixed on little William, with a rather gloomy look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this time, after hearing what Lin Yu said, little William suddenly felt he smiled. "Why did you say this, sir?" At this time, Lin Yu's face suddenly froze when he saw little William like this, and then he glared at little William so hard that his fists clenched. "He's your brother, you want to kill him." At this time, little William just spread his hands and smiled. At this time, he turned around and glared coldly at Lin Yu. "Even Lin Yu, I felt as if I was being targeted by a poisonous snake. I just gave a gift to my dear brother. What he did to me back then was much more excessive than this." At this time, little William said in a cold voice, with a completely cold look in the corners of his eyes and brows. At this moment, after Lin Yu heard what Xiao William said, a sneer appeared at the corner of his mouth. "But you can't seem to kill him." Little William just put the wine glass on the plate held by the wine waiter, put his hands in his pockets, a sneer appeared on the corner of his mouth, and a hint of ridicule flashed in his eyes. "Indeed, he is like an invincible Xiaoqiang who will never be killed. It's so annoying." 3 black lines appeared on Lin Yu's forehead, and he was speechless for a while. At this time, he really didn't know what to say. At this time, little William seemed to have remembered something. He turned his head and glanced at Lin Yu, and then raised his brows slightly. "You have to think carefully. Once you decide to help my brother, it means going to war with me. Do you know what the price will be for going to war with me?" Little William's voice was deep.